In the years immediately following the Second World War, as the alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union dissolved into a sustained geopolitical rivalry, one of the central challenges facing American policymakers was the profound lack of reliable intelligence about conditions inside the Soviet state, a nation that had sealed its borders, restricted foreign access, and constructed a security apparatus designed to prevent outside observation of its military and industrial development. By the early 1950s, the United States possessed only fragmentary information about the scale of Soviet nuclear production, the size of its bomber fleet, and the pace of its missile research. Strategic planners feared that Moscow might possess capabilities far greater than Western estimates suggested. This uncertainty produced what became known as the bomber gap, the belief that Soviet long-range bombers might already outnumber those of the United States, and later a similar concern about a missile gap. Without direct observation, these fears could not be easily resolved. Traditional reconnaissance methods offered limited solutions. Satellite surveillance did not yet exist, and high-altitude aircraft capable of flying deep into Soviet territory faced the risk of interception by increasingly sophisticated air defense systems. In this environment, American intelligence agencies began searching for a technological solution that could penetrate the Soviet Union's closed borders while remaining beyond the reach of existing fighter aircraft and surface-to-air missiles. Out of this strategic necessity emerged one of the most ambitious aerial reconnaissance programs of the Cold War, the development of the U-2 spy plane. The aircraft that would eventually become known simply as the U-2 originated from a collaboration between the Central Intelligence Agency, the United States Air Force, and the Lockheed Corporation's Advanced Development Division, commonly called the Skunk Works, under the direction of engineer Clarence Kelly Johnson. Johnson proposed an aircraft designed specifically for extreme altitude flight, capable of operating at heights exceeding 70,000 feet, far above the operational ceiling of contemporary Soviet interceptors. To achieve this capability, the aircraft incorporated a long, glider-like wingspan that maximized lift in the thin upper atmosphere, a lightweight airframe, and a powerful jet engine adapted for high-altitude performance. The design sacrificed speed and maneuverability in favor of altitude, relying on the assumption that Soviet defenses would be unable to reach the aircraft's operational height. By 1955, the program had advanced from concept to prototype testing at a remote site in Nevada known as Groom Lake, where the secrecy surrounding the aircraft's development was maintained through strict security protocols and limited personnel access. The project was designated as a CIA operation rather than a conventional military program in order to preserve plausible deniability if flights over Soviet territory were discovered. From the beginning, the U-2 program was intended not merely as an engineering achievement, but as a strategic intelligence tool capable of resolving the uncertainties that dominated Cold War planning. The aircraft carried advanced photographic equipment capable of capturing high-resolution images of military installations, missile fields, bomber bases, and industrial complexes from extreme altitude. Cameras developed for the U-2 could photograph objects on the ground with remarkable clarity, allowing analysts to measure runway lengths, count aircraft parked on airfields, and assess the construction progress of missile facilities. These images would be delivered to the CIA's photo interpretation teams, who would analyze the photographs frame by frame to extract intelligence about Soviet military capabilities. When the first operational flights began in December 1956, they quickly produced information that transformed Western understanding of the Soviet strategic posture. Photographs taken during early missions revealed that the feared bomber gap did not exist on the scale previously imagined. Soviet long-range bomber production was far smaller than American planners had feared. The U-2 therefore provided not only intelligence, but also a degree of strategic stability by reducing uncertainty in nuclear planning. Despite its technical success, the U-2 program operated under a constant shadow of risk. Every flight over Soviet territory constituted a violation of national airspace and carried the possibility of diplomatic crisis if the aircraft were detected and destroyed. The CIA and the White House were aware that Soviet radar systems could track the aircraft even if they could not intercept it. The assumption underlying the program was that altitude would provide sufficient protection against attack, allowing the United States to deny involvement if necessary. Missions were carefully planned to minimize exposure while maximizing intelligence collection, and pilots selected for the program underwent specialized training to operate at extreme altitude for long durations. Among those pilots was Francis Gary Powers, a former Air Force fighter pilot recruited by the CIA to fly reconnaissance missions under conditions of strict secrecy. By 1960, after several years of successful flights, confidence in the aircraft's ability to evade Soviet defenses had become routine within the program. Soviet air defense systems had improved during the late 1950s, particularly with the deployment of new surface-to-air missiles, but American intelligence believed that the U-2's altitude still placed it beyond effective range. On May 1, 1960, Francis Gary Powers took off from a base in Peshawar, Pakistan, on what was intended to be a long reconnaissance mission across Soviet territory, photographing missile sites and military installations before landing in Norway. The flight path would carry him deep into the Soviet interior, crossing multiple regions where radar detection was expected, but interception considered unlikely. As Powers climbed to operational altitude, the aircraft stabilized in the thin air of the upper atmosphere, its long wings gliding through the sky as cameras below captured images of the terrain thousands of feet beneath. Unbeknownst to American planners, Soviet air defense capabilities had advanced further than anticipated. Radar operators tracked the aircraft almost immediately after it crossed into Soviet airspace, and interceptor aircraft were scrambled in an attempt to reach its altitude. Although the interceptors struggled to climb high enough to engage the target directly, Soviet commanders ordered the launch of surface-to-air missiles from batteries positioned along the aircraft's projected route. Near the city of Sverdlovsk, one of these missiles detonated close enough to the aircraft to shatter its fragile airframe. The explosion tore apart the wings and forced Powers to eject from the cockpit as the U-2 disintegrated in the sky above Soviet territory. Powers survived the descent and parachuted to the ground, where he was quickly captured by Soviet authorities. His survival immediately transformed what might have been an ambiguous incident into a diplomatic crisis of the highest order. American officials initially believed that the aircraft had been destroyed and the pilot killed, an assumption that allowed them to issue a public statement claiming that a civilian weather research aircraft had strayed off course after experiencing oxygen equipment failure. The cover story was designed to preserve plausible deniability and prevent escalation during a period when the United States and the Soviet Union were preparing for a high-level summit intended to reduce Cold War tensions. The Soviet leadership, however, had anticipated exactly such a denial. Nikita, Khrushchev chose not to reveal immediately that Powers had survived, allowing the United States to repeat its explanation publicly before presenting evidence that exposed the deception. When Soviet officials announced that the pilot had been captured alive and displayed parts of the wreckage along with photographic equipment recovered from the aircraft, The American cover story collapsed almost instantly. The revelation produced international embarrassment for the Eisenhower administration, demonstrating that the United States had conducted extensive aerial espionage operations over Soviet territory while simultaneously denying them. The incident quickly escalated into a major diplomatic confrontation. Khrushchev demanded a formal apology from the United States and assurances that reconnaissance flights would cease. Eisenhower acknowledged responsibility for the program but refused to issue the apology that the Soviet leader demanded, arguing that intelligence collection had been necessary in an environment where secrecy surrounded Soviet military development. The dispute overshadowed the upcoming Paris summit, scheduled for May 1960. Where leaders of the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France had planned to discuss arms control and the future of Berlin. When the conference convened, Khrushchev used the U-2 incident to denounce American actions and withdrew from substantive negotiations, effectively collapsing the summit before meaningful discussion could occur. Meanwhile, Francis Gary Powers remained in Soviet custody, where he was interrogated extensively by Soviet intelligence officers seeking information about the U-2 program, CIA operations, and the structure of American reconnaissance activities. In August 1960, he was put on public trial in Moscow, charged with espionage against the Soviet Union. The trial was widely publicized as a demonstration of Soviet vigilance against foreign surveillance. Powers acknowledged that he had been flying a reconnaissance mission, but emphasized that he had followed instructions and had not resisted capture. He was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment, including 3 years in prison followed by 7 years of hard labor. Despite the severity of the sentence, diplomatic negotiations continued quietly behind the scenes. The United States and the Soviet Union both recognized that the situation could potentially be resolved through a prisoner exchange, a practice that had precedent during the Cold War when captured intelligence agents were traded between rival powers. Over the next 2 years, intermediaries explored possible arrangements that might secure Powers' release while satisfying Soviet demands for reciprocity. Eventually, attention focused on Rudolf Abel, a Soviet intelligence officer captured in the United States in 1957 and serving a prison sentence for espionage. The eventual exchange was arranged to take place at the Glienicke Bridge in Berlin, a location that had already crossing the bridge from East Germany into West Germany. On February 10, 1962, the swap was carried out under careful supervision, with Powers crossing the bridge from East Germany into the western sector, while Abel traveled in the opposite direction. The exchange concluded one of the most dramatic espionage episodes of the Cold War, returning the American pilot home, while allowing the Soviet Union to reclaim one of its most experienced intelligence officers. The U-2 incident left a lasting impact on the trajectory of Cold War relations. It exposed the scale of American aerial surveillance operations, embarrassed the Eisenhower administration, and contributed to the collapse of a summit that might have reduced tensions during a critical period of superpower rivalry. At the same time, it demonstrated the growing effectiveness of Soviet air defense technology and signaled that high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft could no longer operate with impunity. In response, the United States accelerated development of alternative intelligence systems, including satellite reconnaissance programs that would eventually replace aircraft as the primary means of strategic observation. For the participants involved, the episode carried deeply personal consequences. Francis Gary Powers returned to the United States after his release and later worked as a test pilot and helicopter pilot, his experience becoming a defining episode in Cold War intelligence history. The aircraft he had flown, once considered untouchable in the upper atmosphere, became a symbol of both technological innovation and strategic vulnerability. And the diplomatic crisis triggered by its destruction served as a reminder that in the era of nuclear rivalry, even a single reconnaissance flight could alter the course of international relations. In the weeks that followed the destruction of the U-2 over Sverdlovsk, the political repercussions expanded far beyond the loss of a single reconnaissance aircraft, because the incident unfolded at a moment when the leadership of both superpowers had been preparing for what many observers believed could become the most significant diplomatic meeting of the Cold War's first decade. The Paris summit, scheduled for mid-May 1960, was intended to bring together President Dwight D. Eisenhower, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, and French President Charles de Gaulle for negotiations that might ease tensions over Berlin, nuclear testing, and broader questions of strategic stability. Eisenhower had spent years navigating the balance between maintaining strong intelligence collection against the Soviet Union and reducing the risk of confrontation that might escalate into nuclear conflict. The U-2 flights had been authorized within this context. Reconnaissance missions provided detailed knowledge of Soviet missile and bomber capabilities, information that allowed American policymakers to assess threats without relying on speculation. Yet the very secrecy that made those missions effective also created political vulnerability if they were exposed. The May 1st flight occurred just 2 weeks before the summit, and the consequences of its failure unfolded in stages that gradually eroded American credibility on the international stage. When the Soviet government announced that an American aircraft had been shot down over its territory, U.S. officials initially relied on the contingency explanation, prepared in advance of such a possibility. On May 3rd, NASA issued a statement describing the missing aircraft as a weather research plane that had encountered oxygen equipment difficulties while conducting atmospheric sampling along the Turkish-Soviet border. The explanation suggested that the pilot had lost consciousness and that the aircraft had drifted off course into Soviet airspace. At the time the statement was released, American officials believed the pilot had been killed in the crash and that the aircraft's sensitive equipment had likely been destroyed. This assumption proved incorrect. On May 7th, Khrushchev addressed the Supreme Soviet and revealed that Francis Gary Powers had survived the incident and was in Soviet custody. In addition to producing the pilot alive, Soviet authorities displayed the wreckage of the aircraft and the sophisticated surveillance cameras recovered from it, demonstrating that the plane had been engaged in deliberate intelligence collection rather than meteorological research. The carefully staged revelation exposed the American explanation as false and placed Eisenhower in an increasingly difficult position. International reaction was immediate. Allied governments privately supported the necessity of intelligence gathering, but recognized the diplomatic damage caused by the failed cover story. Neutral nations and members of the emerging non-aligned movement criticized the violation of Soviet airspace, interpreting the episode as evidence of superpower espionage conducted without regard for national sovereignty. Within the United States, the administration faced questions in Congress about the scope of aerial reconnaissance operations and the degree of presidential authorization behind them. Eisenhower ultimately acknowledged that the U-2 program existed and that reconnaissance flights had been approved at the highest level of government. He defended the program as a defensive necessity in an environment where Soviet secrecy prevented other forms of verification about military capabilities. Nevertheless, the admission did little to repair the diplomatic consequences. Khrushchev demanded a formal apology and an explicit commitment that such flights would never occur again. Eisenhower refused to issue the apology, arguing that reconnaissance had served the purpose of reducing the risk of surprise attack and therefore contributed to stability rather than aggression. When the Paris summit convened on May 16, 1960, the atmosphere was already shaped by the controversy surrounding the U-2 incident. Khrushchev arrived determined to use the episode to demonstrate Soviet resolve and to challenge American credibility. At the opening session, he demanded that the United States apologize publicly and punish those responsible for authorizing the flights. Eisenhower reiterated that he had approved the program and that he would not apologize for actions he believed were necessary for national security. The confrontation escalated quickly. Khrushchev announced that unless the United States accepted responsibility and provided guarantees against future flights, the Soviet Union would withdraw from substantive negotiations. When Eisenhower refused to meet those conditions, Khrushchev left the conference, effectively collapsing the summit before discussions on Berlin or nuclear testing could proceed. What had been intended as a moment of potential diplomatic progress instead became a demonstration of how intelligence operations could derail high-level diplomacy. Meanwhile, Francis Gary Powers remained imprisoned in the Soviet Union as both a source of intelligence and a symbol of the incident's political significance. Soviet interrogators questioned him extensively about the design of the U-2 aircraft, the structure of the CIA reconnaissance program, and the methods used to plan and conduct missions over Soviet territory. Powers cooperated with questioning, but reportedly avoided revealing classified details beyond what Soviet investigators could already infer from recovered equipment. His presence in custody provided Khrushchev with a powerful propaganda tool. The Soviet press portrayed the pilot as a participant in aggressive espionage directed against the socialist state, while Western observers monitored the situation carefully to assess the treatment he received. In August 1960, the Soviet government conducted a formal trial in Moscow. The proceedings were broadcast widely and framed as a legal demonstration that the Soviet Union had successfully defended its airspace against foreign intrusion. Powers acknowledged that he had been flying a reconnaissance mission and expressed regret for violating Soviet territory. The court sentenced him to 10 years imprisonment, divided between incarceration and hard labor, though the sentence was widely interpreted as leaving room for diplomatic negotiation. Behind the scenes, American officials began exploring possibilities for securing Powers' release through a prisoner exchange. The Cold War had already produced several instances in which captured intelligence operatives were traded between East and West, and both governments recognized that such arrangements allowed them to recover personnel without escalating public confrontation. The most likely counterpart for an exchange was Rudolf Abel, the Soviet intelligence officer arrested by the FBI in New York in 1957 after a lengthy counterintelligence investigation. Abel had been convicted of espionage and sentenced to 30 years in prison, but had not been executed, partly because American authorities recognized that he might eventually serve as leverage in negotiations. Over the next 2 years, intermediaries conducted discreet discussions aimed at arranging a swap that would return Powers to the United States while allowing the Soviet Union to reclaim Abel. During this period, the U-2 incident continued to influence strategic planning within the United States. The successful shoot-down demonstrated that high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft could no longer assume immunity from Soviet air defenses. Surface-to-air missile systems, such as the SA-2 guideline, had proven capable of reaching altitudes once considered safe. As a result, American intelligence agencies accelerated development of alternative surveillance methods. One of the most significant of these was the Corona satellite reconnaissance program, which aimed to photograph Soviet territory from orbit using film return capsules recovered in midair by specially equipped aircraft. Unlike the U-2, satellites operated beyond national airspace and therefore did not violate sovereignty in the same way as aircraft flying directly over foreign territory. The technological transition from aerial to space-based reconnaissance would eventually transform intelligence collection, but in 1960, that shift was still in its early stages. By early 1962, negotiations for a prisoner exchange had progressed far enough to produce an agreement. The location selected for the swap was the Glienicke Bridge, which spanned the Havel River between West Berlin and Potsdam in East Germany. Because Berlin remained divided between Soviet and Western sectors, yet allowed controlled movement across checkpoints, the bridge provided a neutral setting where both sides could conduct the exchange under observation without entering each other's territory. On February 10, 1962, the arrangement was executed with careful coordination. Francis Gary Powers was brought from Soviet custody to East Berlin, while Rudolf Abel was transported from an American prison to West Berlin. At the midpoint of the bridge, under the supervision of officials from both sides, the two men crossed paths and continued in opposite directions, completing one of the most famous prisoner exchanges of the Cold War. The event symbolized the quiet mechanisms through which rival intelligence services managed the consequences of espionage, even while political tensions remained high. The U-2 incident, from the moment of Powers' shoot-down to his eventual return, had lasting implications for the conduct of intelligence operations and the dynamics of superpower rivalry. It exposed the vulnerability of reconnaissance missions that relied on technological advantage without anticipating rapid advances in defensive systems. It demonstrated the political risks inherent in covert operations conducted under the assumption that they would remain secret, and it revealed how the exposure of such operations could reverberate through diplomatic relationships, disrupting negotiations that had taken years to arrange. The destruction of a single aircraft over the Soviet Union thus reshaped intelligence strategy, contributed to the failure of a major international summit, and became one of the defining episodes in the history of Cold War espionage. The prisoner exchange at the Glienicke Bridge in February 1962 closed the immediate chapter of the U-2 incident, but did not erase the broader strategic and political consequences that had unfolded since the morning Francis Gary Powers had crossed into Soviet airspace nearly 2 years earlier. In the months after his return to the United States, Powers underwent extensive debriefings conducted by the Central Intelligence Agency, the Air Force, and congressional investigators who sought to determine whether any operational security had been compromised during his capture and interrogation. Because the wreckage of the aircraft and its photographic equipment had been recovered largely intact by Soviet authorities, intelligence officials assumed that Moscow had already obtained most of the technical information they could extract from the incident. Nevertheless, the debriefings focused on whether Powers had revealed classified operational details during questioning or under pressure while in custody. The results of those inquiries ultimately concluded that he had cooperated with interrogators only within the limits of what Soviet investigators already possessed through the aircraft itself, and that he had not disclosed critical information about other missions or intelligence procedures. Despite those findings, the public reaction in the United States was initially mixed. Some critics questioned whether Powers had destroyed sensitive equipment or activated a self-destruct mechanism that had reportedly been installed in the aircraft. Others argued that he should have used a poison device reportedly issued to U-2 pilots for use in the event of capture. Powers explained that he had not used the device because he had not been instructed that suicide was required, and because the sudden disintegration of the aircraft left him focused on survival rather than destroying the wreckage. Over time, official investigations cleared him of wrongdoing, but the controversy illustrated how the emotional intensity of the Cold War could shape perceptions of individuals involved in intelligence operations. Within the intelligence community, the implications of the shootdown were analyzed with considerable attention to technological and strategic lessons. For several years, the U-2 had provided the United States with unprecedented insight into Soviet military capabilities, resolving uncertainties about bomber production and revealing the scale of missile development. Yet the aircraft's vulnerability to the SA-2 surface-to-air missile system demonstrated that technological advantage could erode quickly as adversaries adapted their defenses. Soviet radar networks had improved throughout the late 1950s, and missile batteries deployed along likely flight paths created layered defenses capable of engaging high-altitude targets. The destruction of Powers' aircraft indicated that continued overflights of Soviet territory carried an increasingly unacceptable risk. As a result, American reconnaissance strategy began shifting decisively towards space-based observation systems that could photograph foreign territory without physically entering national airspace. The Corona satellite program, which had experienced a series of early failures, achieved its first successful mission in August 1960, only a few months after the U-2 incident. Over the following years, satellite reconnaissance would become the primary source of strategic intelligence about the Soviet Union, providing imagery that could reveal missile sites, military bases, and industrial infrastructure across vast distances. Unlike aircraft, satellites operated in orbit, a domain that international law did not treat as sovereign airspace, allowing them to collect intelligence without provoking the diplomatic crises associated with aerial espionage. The incident also influenced political calculations in Washington and Moscow. For President Eisenhower, who was nearing the end of his second term, the exposure of the U-2 program represented one of the most visible diplomatic setbacks of his presidency. Eisenhower had long believed that accurate intelligence about Soviet capabilities was essential for preventing miscalculation in the nuclear age, and he had authorized reconnaissance flights precisely because they reduced uncertainty about the balance of power. Yet the collapse of the cover story and the public revelation of the program undermined American credibility at a critical diplomatic moment. The Paris summit had been intended as an opportunity to ease tensions and address the volatile situation in Berlin, where competing claims between East and West threatened to trigger confrontation. Instead, the summit dissolved into acrimony, and the opportunity for dialogue disappeared. Historians later debated whether meaningful agreements could have emerged from the meeting even without the U-2 incident. But there is little doubt that the shootdown intensified distrust between the superpowers at a moment when communication had briefly seemed possible. For Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, the incident provided both an opportunity and a challenge. Publicly exposing the U-2 program allowed him to demonstrate the effectiveness of Soviet air defenses and to portray the United States as violating international norms through aerial espionage. At the same time, the confrontation with Eisenhower reinforced the atmosphere of rivalry that defined the Cold War. Khrushchev used the episode domestically to highlight the vigilance of Soviet forces in defending national sovereignty, but he also understood that the existence of American reconnaissance flights revealed how seriously the United States regarded Soviet military development. The shootdown therefore reinforced the mutual suspicion that characterized superpower relations during the period. The broader historical significance of the U-2 incident lies in how it illustrates the complex interaction between intelligence collection, technological innovation, and diplomatic strategy during the Cold War. Reconnaissance was essential for understanding the capabilities and intentions of rival states, yet the methods used to obtain that intelligence carried inherent risks. Aerial espionage violated territorial sovereignty and therefore risked political consequences if exposed. The United States had accepted that risk in order to obtain reliable information about Soviet military forces, but the destruction of the U-2 demonstrated that technological assumptions could change rapidly as defensive systems improved. The shift towards satellite surveillance that followed the incident reflected a broader evolution in intelligence practices, one that would eventually reshape the global balance of observation and secrecy. For Francis Gary Powers, the episode became a defining chapter of his life. After leaving government service, he worked as a civilian pilot, eventually flying helicopters for television news organizations. His experience as the pilot of the aircraft that triggered one of the most dramatic espionage crises of the Cold War remained a central part of the historical narrative surrounding the U-2 program. Decades later, the aircraft itself would continue flying in modified forms, demonstrating the enduring value of high-altitude reconnaissance even after the introduction of satellite technology. The events of May 1960 therefore represent both a moment of failure and a turning point, the moment when the limitations of aerial espionage became visible to the world, and when the Cold War intelligence competition began shifting toward the new frontier of space. In the years that followed the U-2 incident, its legacy continued to influence the strategic thinking of both superpowers, shaping how intelligence operations were conducted and how technological innovation intersected with diplomacy during the Cold War. The destruction of Francis Gary Powers' aircraft in May 1960 had demonstrated with unusual clarity that reconnaissance programs, even when designed with extraordinary secrecy and technical sophistication, could trigger international crises if exposed at the wrong political moment. For American policymakers, the episode reinforced the necessity of intelligence collection, while simultaneously illustrating the diplomatic cost of methods that violated national airspace. The paradox at the center of the U-2 program was that it had provided the United States with some of the most valuable intelligence of the Cold War, clarifying the scale of Soviet bomber and missile forces and dispelling exaggerated fears about a strategic imbalance. Yet the exposure of the program threatened to undermine the political stability that such intelligence was intended to preserve. By the early 1960s, American intelligence agencies had concluded that the era of routine overflights of the Soviet Union was effectively over. Soviet air defense networks had matured, surface-to-air missile systems were expanding across the country, and the likelihood of another aircraft being shot down had increased significantly. In response, the United States accelerated its transition towards satellite reconnaissance systems, capable of photographing large sections of the Soviet Union from orbit. Programs such as Corona soon began returning thousands of images that allowed analysts to monitor missile deployments, bomber production facilities, and nuclear testing sites without risking pilots or provoking direct diplomatic confrontation. The shift from aircraft to satellites represented a technological transformation in intelligence gathering, but it was also a strategic adaptation shaped by the lessons of the U-2 crisis. The Soviet Union also drew conclusions from the incident. The successful interception of a high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft reinforced confidence in the expanding network of radar stations, interceptor aircraft, and surface-to-air missile batteries that formed the backbone of Soviet air defense. The shoot-down demonstrated that even aircraft operating at extreme altitude were vulnerable to modern missile systems when supported by coordinated radar tracking and command structures. This realization encouraged continued investment in layered air defense systems throughout the Soviet Union, particularly around major industrial and military regions. At the same time, the incident highlighted the importance of information management within the Soviet political system. Nikita. Khrushchev's decision to reveal the capture of powers only after the United States had publicly denied conducting espionage flights was a calculated move that maximized political impact. By allowing the American explanation to circulate before presenting evidence that contradicted it, Khrushchev transformed the episode into a moment of diplomatic embarrassment for the Eisenhower administration. The strategy demonstrated how intelligence incidents could be leveraged in the political arena, turning operational events into instruments of propaganda and negotiation. In the broader context of Cold War history, the U-2 affair illustrated the fragile balance between secrecy and exposure that characterized intelligence operations during the nuclear age. Both superpowers relied heavily on covert methods to understand each other's capabilities and intentions. Reconnaissance satellites, signals intelligence, and human espionage networks all played roles in reducing uncertainty about the rivals' military posture. Yet the secrecy surrounding these activities meant that when operations became public, they could trigger intense political reaction. The destruction of the U-2 and the capture of its pilot exposed the hidden infrastructure of American surveillance at a moment when diplomatic dialogue had seemed possible. The collapse of the Paris summit in May 1960 therefore became one of the clearest examples of how intelligence operations could intersect with high-level diplomacy in unpredictable ways. Although tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union remained high, regardless of the incident, the failure of the summit eliminated a rare opportunity for dialogue during a critical phase of the Cold War. For historians and intelligence professionals alike, the episode offers insight into the evolving relationship between technology and strategy. The U-2 itself represented a remarkable engineering achievement, capable of operating in the thin atmosphere at altitudes previously unattainable for operational aircraft. Its cameras produced imagery of extraordinary clarity, allowing analysts to identify details on the ground that had previously been inaccessible. Yet the aircraft's design relied on a single principle, altitude as protection, that became increasingly vulnerable as missile technology improved. The shoot-down near Sverdlovsk demonstrated that technological advantages are rarely permanent in strategic competition. As one side develops a new capability, the other adapts its defenses in response, producing a cycle of innovation and countermeasure that defines much of military technology. The transition from aerial reconnaissance to satellite observation in the early 1960s was one manifestation of this process, reflecting the continuing search for methods that could collect intelligence while minimizing the risk of political confrontation. The personal stories associated with the incident also contributed to its enduring place in Cold War memory. Francis Gary Powers, the pilot whose aircraft had been destroyed over Soviet territory, spent nearly 2 years in captivity before his exchange for Soviet intelligence officer Rudolf Abel at the Glinica Bridge in 1962. That exchange became one of the most famous examples of Cold War prisoner diplomacy, symbolizing the shadow world of espionage in which captured agents could be traded between rival powers, even as official hostility continued. Powers' experience illustrated the human dimension of intelligence operations, where individuals operating under secret orders could suddenly find themselves at the center of international controversy. His eventual return to the United States closed the immediate chapter of the crisis, but the events of May 1960 remained a reminder of how fragile the boundary between covert activity and public confrontation could be. The U-2 incident therefore stands as a pivotal moment in the history of Cold War intelligence. It revealed the extent of American aerial surveillance operations, demonstrated the effectiveness of Soviet air defenses, and disrupted a major diplomatic initiative between the superpowers. At the same time, it accelerated the development of new technologies that would redefine intelligence gathering for decades to come. The shift toward satellite reconnaissance allowed both sides to observe each other's strategic forces with increasing precision, contributing indirectly to the stability of nuclear deterrence by reducing uncertainty about the balance of power. In that sense, the episode that began with the destruction of a single aircraft ultimately helped shape the evolution of intelligence practices during the latter half of the 20th century. The humiliation of the failed cover story, the collapse of the Paris summit, and the dramatic exchange on the Glienicke Bridge all became part of the narrative through which the Cold War's hidden conflicts were revealed to the world.